Welcome everybody to the first Speedrun episode of 2025. I am back home from the World Rapid and Blitz, so for those who supported my run and rooted for me, I could not have performed well without you, so a huge shout out to the entire community for believing in me. It was a very emotionally, mentally, even physically taxing couple of days, but I'm very proud of the result, and I will be doing a series on YouTube where I recap all of the games from the Rapid and Blitz. I share my thoughts on the event and sort of the state of the chess world. So that'll be coming out throughout the next couple of weeks for those who are interested in a deep dive of my experience. And I think I played some interesting games. But in parallel, let's continue doing the speed run. And without further ado, let's dive into some games and keep getting our rating up. All right. Here we go. Approaching 1600, so approaching the sort of high intermediate level. And let's continue playing our regular repertoire. Hopefully, those of you who are watching my games caught that I was playing the Glek system pretty religiously in the Blitz, and I was pretty successful. I got some great positions out of it against GMs. I was playing it in a slightly different move order. I was mostly playing knight to c3 first and then g3. Most of the time, it's just going to transpose. So here we're going to keep the sort of traditional four knights move order, which I think is the easiest way to learn the Glek. But black deviates with bishop c5. We faced this move before. And I would say mostly this move occurs at the sort of lower beginner levels because it walks directly into a move that should be automatic to you. Like at this point, if you've been following the speedrun carefully, like your brain should supply this move even before you fully understand like why you've come up with it. And that, of course, is the center fork trick with knight takes e5, which occurs very frequently in the Glek. And we've definitely had this exact position and many versions of this position in the speedrun. And I've gone over many times the main concern that newer players have when they enter this line, which is that the white king seems very exposed. I won't rehash the logic. The main point, of course, is that black just doesn't have the offensive firepower, the attacking firepower to do anything about the king's temporarily exposed position. And in return for this, visually appealing but ultimately meaningless weakening, black has given up like everything. Black has made way too many concessions, given up the dark squared bishop, and of course the main thing, given up total central control, which we can now claim with the move d4. Not the only move, but definitely the most straightforward way to assert our advantage. Chasing away the knight. Queen h4 check. Okay. So a fairly meaningless check because, first of all, our king wants to drop back to g1. Now, one thing I remember talking about is the importance of not playing king g1 before you have retracted the rook out of h1. This is called castling by hand or manual castling. So I remember highlighting that one of white's typical plans here is to bring out the bishop and literally perform the castling operation manually. In Russian, it's искусственная рокировка, artificial. It's like the same word as artificial intelligence, artificial castling. What would ChatGPT do here? So instead of king g1, the other move we can consider is g3. And I actually much prefer the move g3. Not because it wins a piece. It does not win a piece because of queen f6 check. But the purpose of this is to fianchetto our king. Now our king gets the g2 square, and we do not lock out our own rook. On top of that, this queen on f6 is going to be extremely vulnerable both to a potential knight jump to d5, but also to a rook sliding onto the f file. So black is already in huge trouble, which is actually kind of a soft way of putting it. I think black is probably lost just because our initiative is going to just tear black apart, I think. Now, this is an instructive moment, actually, because we've had similar situations before. I think newer players and even some advanced players would very quickly slam the knight down on d5, and you'd feel really good about yourself. Like, I'm getting the knight into the center with tempo. What could be better? Hitting the queen, hitting the pawn on c7. Actually, I think knight d5 is not the best way to prosecute the initiative here. Why not? Well, it's a good example of one move-itis, actually. Why does it feel good to play this move? Because, well, it centralizes the knight, but it also hits the queen. You're driving the queen back to d8, and the knight on d5 is actually not all that impressive. First of all, it can be chased away with c6. And c6 is a beneficial move for black because then black could follow up potentially with d5, reclaiming a share of the center. But in addition, after knight d5, queen d8, you're blocking, like if you then play bishop c4, you're no longer putting pressure on the f7 pawn. And when black develops the knight from g8, he will be making contact with your knight on d5, potentially leading to trades, and trades typically favor the side that's defending against the initiative. So, sorry, that's a very long-winded explanation, but there is a much better move. And the much better move, as you can probably guess, is just bishop c4. This sets up an actually serious threat of rook f1, and this one is much harder to deal with. Here, if black plays queen d8, the avalanche is just going to descend on the f7 pawn. And black does not defend against it, which means we win the game with rook f1. But a good moment to really pause and make sure you understood the logic. Yeah, now our opponent realized, like, wait a second, f7 is falling with check, depending on where black plays. If queen e7, you should be sort of actively thinking about how to capture on f7, because the piece that we capture with might actually change based on where the queen moves back to. Queen e7. Okay, so again, knight d5, very bad move here. Also because it drops c4 with check. We want to take on f7. I actually think here the clinical move is rook takes f7, whereas if black had played queen d8, I think we would have taken with the bishop on f7. And actually, wait, am I changing my mind here? Let me think. I think bishop f7 is also very good, but it leads to needless complications. I think rook f7 is just much cleaner because it hits the queen. This is not a kind of difficult logic. Okay, now we can go for checkmate. And we can do that a variety of different ways. What are the candidate moves that come to our mind? Well, I'm seeing that the rook is... Well, first of all, I'm seeing that we can take on g7. And maybe that's the best move, just rook takes g7, just chomp chomp. Let's quickly look for any other more decisive moves. I'm seeing the move knight to b5, right? Contact between pieces and pawns. But knight b5 seems artificial. Black can play a move like bishop d7. So are there any counter arguments to just continuing to take stuff? Take. I don't see any. Let's just play the simplest move, rook takes g7. And a great benefit of this move is that it opens up potentially a pathway for our dark squared bishop to join the attack, either via g5 or even via h6. Right? If the knight moves out, let's say to e7 or f6, as it just did. Now pause the video and see if you can find the most clinical way to finish off the attack without giving black, chances to keep the game going. So a lot of you are, and I'll address queen f3 after the game. I know a lot of you are pining for queen f3. We'll talk about that. Yeah, bishop f7 check, very good. King f8 is the most natural, and then the other bishop moves up to h6 with a mating net, which is exactly how the game is going to end. If black had played king to d7, then queen g4 check would have set up a king hunt. And there was a beautiful checkmating. Well, yeah, I don't know if I would have been able to set it up, but clearly queen g4 check would have led to mate, and then a king c6 d5. And this is just mate in one, rook takes h7. Boom. That's how we get it done. Let's paste this into chess base. All right. And let's take a look. Pretty short work of our opponent, but it's all because of bishop c5. That's just like a move that asks for trouble. And most people don't know how to follow it up properly. All right. So knight c6, knight c3. So again, knight f6, g3 is the Glek system. And where else do we see the center fork trick? Well, if bishop c5, bishop g2, as I've explained many times, castles walks into knight takes e5. So this idea is not unheard of. Where else in our repertoire do we get the center fork trick? Well, as far as I can remember, I'm just trying to think, do we get this in our Najdorf repertoire? Okay, in previous speedruns where we played the accelerated dragon with black, there was a line I showed, like the Bowdler attack with bishop c4. There was a line where black played knight f6, like rook e1 and knight takes e4. This is a very topical line. So this is just a concept that occurs in many, many different openings. So knight takes e5, bishop f2 is, of course, a mistake. The proper way to meet this is knight takes e5, d4, and now bishop to d6, preserving the bishop pair. And black is still worse. Like, it's not like black is doing great here after de bishop e5. Does anybody remember in this position, white has a bit of a counterintuitive move that he should play? Does anybody remember, I've went over this before, how should white develop their, like, what is the best move here? because it's not immediately obvious. And I'm not expecting people to remember this. Like, this is why I do these reviews. It's not bishop c4. I think this is maybe what a lot of you guys are thinking, either bishop c4 or f4. Now, f4 is wrong. It's premature. It's not terrible, but it allows black to trade on c3, and these pawns might end up being a little bit loose. Like, black will play d6 and then knight f6. There is a better way to play. Bishop c4, the problem with this move is, and I'm double checking this just to make sure I'm telling you the truth. After knight f6, again, the e4 pawn becomes a serious liability. Serious liability. Like castles, castles, and now you have to deal with the threat of bishop takes c3. So the correct move is bishop to d3. The correct move is bishop to d3. And the point of this move is that you're overprotecting the e4 pawn, and in the future, it is very likely that the bishop is chased away from e5, and then you will have the option of pushing the pawn up and reopening the diagonal for the bishop. And this is the concept of potential energy, right? A piece doesn't have to be good at the present moment, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have value in the long run, right? So you have to appreciate how the game is likely to go, and that is why often you see people putting pieces like rooks on a closed file, or a bishop on a closed diagonal might be a major asset. It might be the game-winning piece later down the line. So as a quick example of this type of thing in action, just a second. This is a game that actually made it into my book. So it's just funny. Like, I won't go over this game in depth right now. I'm just going to show you a funny, like an interesting narrative that this game had. Yeah, so basically this is an old game of mine that I played in 2008. There's a lot of instructive concepts in this game, but I just want you to notice this bishop on g2. Okay, just pay attention to this bishop, right? So it's a complicated game, lots of mistakes by both sides. But this bishop is like behind the pawn for like the entire game. This bishop doesn't do anything. Like, all the other pieces do the heavy lifting. And eventually I got annoyed by the fact that my light squared bishop was not doing anything. So, okay, so I transferred the knight. Now the bishop is uncontested. But I never lost hope in the fact that one day this bishop would have its moment in the sun. And so first I tried to reactivate it with the move king h2, which is a pretty instructive move. I was pretty proud of this move. Who can tell me what the idea of king h2 is? Who can tell me what the idea of king h2 is? Pretty classic concept here. Yeah, it's to play h4 and then to play bishop h3 and just transition to this diagonal. But then my opponent played this move queen b5, and suddenly I developed, well, I never lost hope in the future of the bishop. So here I kept my eyes open and I found a tactic, and it's a very advanced tactic. And it starts with bishop takes knight. So of course the point is that if he takes to the e-pawn, I can play e5 and reopen the bishop. And the bishop is a beast. But of course he plays cd, and now who can tell me? You should pause the video here if you're watching on YouTube and try to find this move, because it's a tactic, but also in order to properly evaluate this, you have to spot your opponent's, like, black's best response. Yeah, rook f7. Now, black had seen this. My opponent had spotted this move, and he had prepared the move queen takes c4. And after bc rook f7, it's two rooks against a queen, and this bishop is still very bad, but my opponent stopped calculating here, failing to spot my next move, which is the decider, queen to g5. And suddenly, everything falls. Like, this pawn is hanging. If it's captured, then h5 will fall. My opponent decides to go into the counterattack, but now I take the pawn on e5. And then I take the pawn on d4. You see where this is going. And finally, I get to play e5. And as soon as this bishop opens up, it wins the game immediately, because b7 is way too weak and it cannot be defended. So like just queen d7, e6, and it's over. And the bishop plays the deciding role in the final position of the game because it protects the b7 pawn. So, you know, it sounds corny or whatever, but believe in your pieces and remember that just because a piece is blocked by a pawn doesn't mean it doesn't have potential energy, which is how I like to refer to it. And it's still on g2, exactly. All right. So hopefully that wasn't too long-winded. Very important point, right? So bishop d3 to get back to the analysis. And black plays knight f6 most of the time. Okay, so here you can castle. Black will likely castle. And now among many things that you can do, you can play the move bishop to g5, and everything is set up for f4. So if h6, you can just drop the bishop back to h4. Black basically can't stop f4. And then e5 will become a very powerful threat. So that's kind of the key. Let's see. Our opponent played bishop f2, and already after d4, the situation is essentially critical. Black should play knight g6 here. This is the best move, according to the computer. Now you can just develop your bishop, for example, to e2, and you complete the castling by hand. d6, rook f1, and after king g1, you're going to have a phenomenal position. After queen h4 check, black is already like complete. That's actually +4. Oh, shoot, I missed a win here. See, this is where the computer can really give you some insight. So king g2 is actually not the best move. It's still winning, but you can win on the spot. Wow, that's actually super cool. White to play. See how powerful, like making assumptions. Like you just assume the king has to move, right? But the winning move is bishop f4 because it's self-pinning the bishop, but the knight is hanging. You're threatening to take it with the pawn. And the moment the knight moves back, now knight d5 wins the game, obviously, because c7 falls to the fork. See, I didn't even think about this at all. But bishop f4 wins the game. All right, so part of tactical acumen is not assuming or immediately like ruling out certain moves. You just have to give them the time of day. Yeah, really nice insight here. Bishop f4 wins the game, but king g2 is plenty good enough. Knight g6, bishop c4. And okay, even if black goes queen d8 here, I think after rook f1, the game is essentially over because, well, knight f6, there's e5. You can analyze this on your own. And the last moment I wanted to make, queen f3, a lot of you were falling in love with this move. It's perfectly fine, but black can go knight f6 here. Like, I feel like you're biased because you see the mate threat, rook f8 check. I know it's pretty, but you know the queen can become quite vulnerable in this square, so I really don't see the point of playing queen f3. You should always gravitate toward the simplest move, whether it's a capture or a move whose... Why does this game keep coming up? Whose logic you understand. And that's that. Any questions, folks? Yeah, of course, last thing I'll point out, if black had given a check on f6, right, instead of h4, you can play king g1. So this rule about not locking out your own rook, it's not like a golden rule, right? It's okay to temporarily lock out the rook. And one way you can circumvent that is by pushing the h-pawn and opening up a pathway through h3. Like h4 is a move you should not forget about because the rook essentially develops without making a single move. And of course, if black plays knight h4, you can play like knight d5 and queen h5 or whatever. Rook takes h4. The computer line here is bishop g5, just everything to the 5th rank, f6. And look at this, boom, e5. Oh my gosh, f takes g5, and now simply bishop d3. This is completely unstoppable. Even if black plays knight e7, you can still play bishop takes g6, queen takes g6, and then you take the whole house. Your computers are really good at attacking. Who would have known? Who would have known? But it's fun. It's fun. It teaches you a lot of lessons about attacking. Let's move on. Let's play the next game. Let's do one more 10-minute game. Let's jump in. We're black against knight 3-7, 3-2, 8, 2-5, 5-7, 8, 9. And we get to play King's Indian. Lovely. Or not. Okay, so we are still going to play a King's Indian structure. Now, I have advocated previously for the move c5 here. And what I've said is that c5 is an excellent way to meet the London. But if you are a King's Indian player and white plays knight f3, and then only after g6 plays bishop f4, you have to be prepared to play g6 against the London due to that move order. So we might as well play g6 here. Queen d2 is already like not a move. But it gives us a good chance to talk about how to like react to like weird setups in the King's Indian. Because when players start out playing the King's Indian, one of their mistakes is that they basically pre-move the same set of moves every game, and you cannot do that. Like, you cannot just blindly play bishop g7, castles d6 and e5 against everything. You have to react dynamically to what your opponent does. And I've talked about this at length in other games. You have to be ready to play c5 in certain positions. And in some positions, you have to be ready to play like a Grunfeld setup with d5. So it's pretty clear to me that white is preparing to go bishop h6 against bishop g7. And frankly, I don't see any need for us to allow that. So there's many good approaches here. Many good approaches. But in order to punish your opponent for like making a move as awkward as queen d2, the general approach is to strike in the center immediately. So I'm always biased toward the move c5. Although, yeah, bishop g7 and castles is also fine. Let me think. I'm actually trying to figure out what the most accurate. Let's actually start with d5. Let's take a middle ground approach. Let's grab as much of the center as we can and preserve the ability to play c5 potentially on the next move. I don't see the point of playing d6 here, because then white could end up playing knight c3 and we might get move ordered into a perk, which we don't play. Okay, knight c3 anyway. So we're almost transposing into a Jabava London. Not even almost. We are like, yeah, bishop g7, and we've essentially transposed into a line of the Jabava London. Like d4, knight f6, knight c3 here. We play d5, white plays bishop f4, we play g6, and white plays the move queen d2. So via very weird move order, we have transposed, and here the move is bishop g7. Now we have some theory. Bishop h6. And now a very important moment, because knowing what to do in this scenario, I think teaches you a lot about this type of structure. The correct move for black is bishop takes bishop. And the entire point is to deflect the queen. And what are we deflecting the queen away from? Because you might say, well, isn't this bad for black? Black can't castle now. Like, what are we doing? Well, we're deflecting the queen away from the d4 pawn. And as I've explained many times, the positional drawback of playing the move knight c3 in the queen's pawn opening is that the d4 pawn becomes like inherently more weak. And the way to attack it is to play c5. And if white's pawn starts to sway, like what's that bridge in Seattle? Like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in the 40s. Like it starts to bend and buckle. And if we can remove that pawn from d4, the floodgates tend to open in the center. So here we have many ways to continue pressuring the pawn. We can play c takes d4, but there's no need to rush that. We can start with knight c6. White is not threatening anything because queen g7 can always be met with rook g8. You should remember that. The queen is a pest, but as long as it's just like chilling on h6, white doesn't have the defensive firepower to control the situation in the center. And so he plays dc. Now, of course, we have an array of options, but the classic response is to develop the queen to the side, queen a5. If you're a Grunfeld player, this move is sort of second nature to you. I'm assuming that white's going to castle queenside, which they do. And again, easy does it. All right, there's no need to start calculating ridiculous things. There's no need to play the impulsive knight g4, which I know some of you are tempted by. Again, this is one move-itis because the queen can just slide back. And the d5 pawn is needlessly. We can just take on c5. The simpler, the better. Yeah, bishop e6, actually not a bad move. Actually, I mean, some people are joking, but I considered the move bishop e6. Potential energy, very good. I see people applying the concept. That very well might be where we end up developing the bishop. Although I'm, obviously bishop f5 or bishop g4 is more likely. Okay, time to complete our development. Where do we want to bring this bishop out? Well, let's weigh the pros and cons. I don't dislike bishop e6, but I think bishop g4 is far more natural, as is bishop f5 in this case. Even bishop d7 can be considered. Not easy. I like bishop g4. Bishop g4 is more positional, but why not? Because h3, we're just going to trade it for the knight, which means we increase our control over the d4 square, which means in the future we might consider pushing the pawn to d4. So why not? Bishop f5, I didn't love the look of bishop d3. I feel like simplification favors white here. I think bishop g4 is just a little more to the point. Okay, queen g5 looks like a vague response. I'm not sure what white is trying to do. I guess white is trying to threaten knight takes d5. But I'm already starting to smell some tactics here. First of all, we can just chase this queen away from g5. If it's annoying us, we can chase it away with h6. Sorry, I'm not saying much because I'm actually calculating. There are some crazy lines here. Okay, I have a cool idea. Just trying to see if it works. There. Holy smokes. I need to write this down because this is went wild. So that doesn't work. So we go there. C3. Wow. Don't worry, you will get the full story of what I'm calculating. Okay, so let's not get too bogged down because we're down to 4 minutes. Let's play simple chess. Let's play simple chess. And let's go h6. Let's chase the queen away. Basically, what I'm trying to figure out is, do we want to castle queenside? Or do we want to deploy the rook to c8, which is the standard way of attacking down the c file? I don't love castling queenside because it's a weak area of the board, and I really, really want to punish white for his sort of loose play. So let's go rook c8. Setting up, of course, an x-ray against the c2 pawn, and ensuring that this knight isn't a moving target. Knight e5 is just a straight-up blunder. Yeah, I feel like white is just learning the Jabava London and is sort of like making the moves, but without really considering them properly. This just hangs the rook on d1, which we're going to take. That's a free juicer. Knight takes c6. Okay, so that helps us, but let's not play queen takes c6 because of bishop b5. See how easy it is to blunder? Let's not do anything impulsively. We have a desperado, right? So we have a scenario with two hanging pieces. That immediately tells you that, okay, I should ask myself, can I give this bishop away while inflicting maximum damage on white's position? And while this is totally unnecessary, it doesn't hurt. Bishop takes c2, opening up the king. Now, white can also desperado with knight takes c7, but this whole operation is going to benefit black because at the end of the day, white's king is going to be the one that's weakened. Now let's castle, finally get the king out of the center. Finally get the king out of the center. Yes, I see that we are, quote-unquote, hanging the pawn on h6. Your eyes should be entirely focused on the king on c2. Now, again and again and again, in attacking chess, the fancy solution should be your last resort. Your first resort should be essentially looking at the simplest move on the board. So what is preventing us from essentially getting to white's king? Well, the only defender is the knight on c3. So some of you might be tempted by moves like d4 or like b5, but try to use your pieces. Like, can you use your pieces? Well, if I frame it that way, then the move should become very obvious, which is knight e4. And this just ends the game. Now, what are we actually threatening when we play knight e4? Well, what we're actually threatening is to play knight takes c3. The pawn slides away, and then our queen can just infiltrate a gazillion different ways. Like, we can go queen a3 there, queen f6. The king is just left all alone. Queen e4 does not hang a queen because the knight was pinned. It's GG. It's the white can resign. On top of that, we can set up, well, we can follow up with queen b4. I'm assuming that white's going to go bishop d3, by the way, but that will force our hand. Okay. Knight takes c3. It is. Nothing changes with the move. Bishop d3, we can do exactly the same stuff I just described. We can even play queen b4. But the pawn on g6 does an incredible job of keeping white's pieces at bay. And I kind of blundered bishop takes g6, but we're mating. Or are we mating, actually? Wait a second. Did I just make a serious boo-boo? I might have, yeah. I think I did. Okay, wait, now let me focus for a second. I think we're still winning, but I have to be very precise now. I forgot that after rook c3, the king can go back to b1. So I got too cavalier here. Just a second, some damage control. Yeah, we're still winning, fortunately. We can play queen takes c3. Some damage control is required. My bad. And some of you spotted this very quickly. I'm impressed. The queen can slide back to g6. Actually, wait, what am I saying? No, what am I saying? We have a very simple winning move here. We have a very simple winning move. It's not queen g7. Queen g7, yeah, it forces the queen trade, but we'll have to win that endgame. Yeah, just take it. Right, take it, and then if queen takes g6, it's not perpetual anymore because of queen g7. Exactly, so thank God. And here, the best way to escape the checks is just slide the king away to h8. Whew. Yeah, there was no need to allow this, but no harm, no foul. Now rook c6. Yeah, by the way, queen h3, queen h7 was a check. Would have forced the queens off. And now it's time to put white out of their misery. Rook b6 check. The king probably has to step up. Okay, time for our opponent to resign. Rook takes f2. And now the simplest way to win rather than trying to look for mate and burning all of your time, notice the alignment of the king and the queen, right? So immediately I'm asking myself, like, how do I set up rook d6? Well, the move then becomes very obvious. Queen g6 check, e4, rook d6. Right? So I always remind people of this. When you're up a lot of material, mate is not the only thing you should be looking for. You should just be looking for ways to like win the queen, because that's essentially as good as mate. Now rook d6. This, I think, will cause our opponent to conclude that further resistance is futile. GG. That was there were some more adventures there than I signed up for. So this is a great game to actually check at least the opening with a computer, because often the computer gives you really interesting insights into like how to punish these types of weird moves like queen to d2. So I'm curious like how my reaction holds up. Probably d5 was not the best move, would be my guess. All right. So just a second here. Yeah, so first of all, just to get like things straight in our brain, previously I have played c5 against the London system. And you might remember that like after e3, my recommendation is to bring the queen out to b6. But if white plays knight f3 and you play g6, and then white plays bishop f4, you have been essentially move ordered into a King's Indian London. And I'm sure we will get these positions in the future, so I'm not going to analyze this right now. Let's focus on what our opponent did in the game. So if white plays knight c3, it's a Jabava London after d5. Okay, and after queen to d2, this is the main line. Bishop g7, or one of the main lines. In my Jabava course with Bortnik, we recommend e3, bishop g7, and then h4. And this is its own theory. In any case, queen d2 immediately is obviously a very awkward move, but it doesn't mean that it like loses the game or anything. So let's see. So I played d5. Yeah, d5 is one of the best moves. Yeah, d5 is actually the top move, along with bishop g7. Not so bad. And after knight c3, bishop g7. Yeah, we get into like a slightly inferior Jabava London line, because queen d2 is not white's best move. By the way, also good was bishop g7. And if white plays bishop h6, here black gets the advantage with a very similar operation to the one that we did in the game. Bishop h6, queen h6, and now the move should be natural to use, just c5. And white is just unable to sustain the situation in the center. Like if white plays e3, black wins the game with queen b6. Like this is just a straight up fork. So a good takeaway for people is that you should not just automatically meet a move like bishop h6 with short castle. Remember, taking can take the attention of your opponent away from the center, which is precisely what we did. Bishop h6 is premature. And after bishop h6, queen h6. Wow, actually there's a lot of games in the database here. A lot of games in the database. And a lot of grandmaster games. Looks like c5 is not the best move. Wow, according to the computer, I didn't realize that this was so theoretically pertinent. According to the computer, short castles here might be slightly more accurate, but I don't want to get bogged down in the like particulars of this theory. After c5, it looks like white's best move is actually dc. Very interesting. It looks like white's best move is dc, but e3 is also good. Still a lot of games in the database. I'm looking at Jabava Cheparinov, Jabava Van Wely. Lots of grandmaster games here. So white played d takes c5. Still some grandmaster games. Queen to a5. And in this position, white made long castles. Wow, still a lot of games. Like we have this position, Grishuk Dominguez. Can you guys believe this? We actually went down a very like popular theoretical line. Knight f3 is the main move. Bishop g4. We're still following some grandmaster games. And the position is approximately equal according to the computer, but queen g5 is a novelty. Like this is actually the mistake our opponent played. Wow, so we actually followed one of the main lines. So what I'm seeing is that white might have had some better moves, such as bishop b5 in this position, but again, this is not particularly interesting. This is like theoretical minutia. Let's get to like the important points here. So after bishop g4, the grandmaster games in this position continued bishop to b5. White develops the bishop to the same type of square. And now, yeah, 2401 versus 2601. was bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and long castles, with a very complicated, combative, approximately equal position. What's interesting is if white plays bishop takes c6, black can actually take with a pawn and solidify the pawn on d5. So just very, very complicated, but our opponent plays a novelty queen to g5. And here, the line that I was trying to work out is rook to c8. That's the line that I was calculating. And of course, white's response is presumably knight takes d5. And here I was trying to figure out, is there a way to exploit the mate threat against c2? So the point is that if you move the knight to a random square, then of course white can play knight takes f6, that's a check, and then trade queens. That's out of the question. But black has a very clever knight move. Can anybody spot it? That prevents this idea while setting up the mate threat. Yeah, knight e5, exactly. The point being, if white plays knight f6, I think he loses the game, because there's a double attack on the queen and the mate on c2. But at first I thought that this worked perfectly, but then I spotted that white has a counter deflection. Bishop to b5 check, and I think this might bust the line. Because if queen takes b5, then I think queen takes e5, and white is potentially just winning here, just because there's a gazillion threats. And the problem is that if you try to preserve the mechanism with king f8, the queen can slide back to h6. Then that gives white the option of liquidating with knight f6, and the bishop drops back to a4, and I didn't see anything here. And I thought this was way too messy. If bishop b5 check, bishop to d7, trying to block with the bishop, then I was calculating bishop takes d7. I spotted knight takes d7. And here, white has many moves. White can even just drop the knight back to e1. Okay, so that's what I was looking at. Let me check with the computer. So rook to c8. Yeah, knight takes d5. Probably I'm wrong on everything. Wow, black is much better here, but not with knight e5. Knight e5, there's also just c3. There's literally also just the move c3, and white is much better. Yes, c3, because if knight takes d5, then queen takes e5. If knight takes f3, then simply knight takes f6, the f6, and queen takes g4. Black's attack fizzles out. I know this is pretty involved stuff. The best move for black here is bishop f5. This is the reason why rook c8 was a pretty good move. And the knight is hanging, the pawn is hanging, same type of idea. White has to drop the knight back to c3, and now black launches a huge attack with knight b4. And white can give a check, but the king just slides away to g8. And if bishop a4, it's time for some incredible tactics. Knight takes a2, deflection. Knight takes a2, watch this. Now you might think, oh, it's bishop takes c2. Well, no, it's not, because bishop c2 allows the queen trade. It loses the game. It's b5. And now, if bishop takes c2 doesn't work, how should you start? What should you do first? What should you do first? You should play, no, not a5, folks. Think about it. Why does bishop take c2 fail? Yeah, you play h6. You just play this tiny move h6, you force the queen away from the x-ray, and now bishop takes c2 wins the game. So you might sit there and scratch your beard and be like, why did we play b5 first? Why not just h6 immediately? Well, there's a beautiful detail, which is that after queen f4, bishop takes c2. White has a winning move. Can anybody tell me what it is? You should pause the video and you should figure it out. Should pause the video and figure it out. Yeah, horse to d4 is no, not knight d4. It's b4. It's pawn to b4, attacking the tail of the discovery, the piece that's giving the check. And the queen has no squares on the c-file. This is covered. All of the squares are covered. And if the queen moves back, then the bishop takes bishop. So the point of b5 is that in this position, white simply doesn't have b4. The queen is safe, and black wins the game. Pretty lovely stuff. Shows you the importance of these little in-between moves. If white plays b4 here, you can go queen c4, bishop b3, queen takes b3. So this is not effective here. Dude, it's all in the details. Right? You want to know how grandmasters train tactics? It's all about the details. And unfortunately, the game ended prematurely after rook c8. White just blundered everything with knight e5. But I already think black is a great position here because of this pressure. I would just point out one last thing, which is that I made a very sloppy move, queen a3. Can you do the same thing without allowing bishop g6? The answer is yes. I should have just gone queen f6. This would have avoided any potential adventures. So I was fortunate that like I had the option of just taking the bishop. Otherwise, things would have gotten a lot dicier. I think a lot of you guys would have taken rook takes c3. And the problem with the rook takes c3 is that suddenly the king slides to b1. And believe it or not, black is still winning here. This is insane. Last question, you should really pause, especially if you're a more advanced player. This is a good exercise. How does black preserve a huge to decisive advantage here? Before you think, queen takes a2, the king can escape around to f3. Okay, although you can do this also, yeah. But my question is, what should black do? White is threatening mate in 1. So the answer is rook b3, sacking an entire rook. Now, obviously, the king can't go to the c file because the other rook comes into the attack, but white goes king a1. How does black make progress here? Well, the answer is that you staircase. You staircase your way to a6 so that you can pick up this bishop with the pawn, and now white has no perpetual, and the king is just going to get massacred. Yeah, absolutely beautiful. So even rook c3 was winning, but it definitely wasn't the most convincing. Yeah, pretty cool stuff. So what is the takeaway from this? It was a very technical game. I apologize for I feel like it was a little bit sort of meh, but a couple of good lessons nonetheless, like bishop takes h6, and then remaining flexible, right? Like not automatically in the king's Indian just putting the pawn on d6 every time because, well, here white goes knight c3 and you can't stop e4. And we don't play the perk in this speedrun. Yeah, so for newer players, the reason we made such a fuss out of this is because if you take the bishop, it's perpetual check. Okay, like the king cannot escape. This is a classic idea that you should be super familiar with even as a beginner. And of course, like if you try to evacuate the king, then you just get checkmated. So that's why these bishop g6 tactics can be so scary. Okay, guys, let's play one 5-minute game and then we'll call it a night. It's been a very long stream, so might be a bit of a shorter speedrun. Now we're 2,000, so let's get our act together here. Yeah, what a fascinating game. Let's analyze. Actually, let me put this into chess space. There's a lot of options there. Okay, 1982. Patrick Nixon. F4. All right, rawr. Okay, so a lot of ways we can play against the bird system. I'm going to play this move that my friend showed me, which is knight h6. Knight h6 is a much better move than it looks. And I actually played it in an OTB game that you can find on YouTube. I'll link it in the YouTube description. Against this guy, Robert Ramirez, who's a national master from Florida. Knight h6 is a pretty interesting move. Now, the point is actually not so complicated. The point of the move knight h6 is you want to carve out the f5 square. And you do that, of course, by quickly pushing d5. So let's push d5. And this knight is going to join society very nicely, French style, via f5. Now, what makes this position better than a French is that this bishop on c8 is able to move outside the pawn chain. Now, you might say, okay, so let's go bishop f5, but then why would we put the knight on h6? We should go bishop g4. We should try to get the bishop exchanged, then play e6, and we get like a dream French. So there's no need to take on f3 until we have to. And now, oh man, now we're going to get like a French on major steroids because, you know, if you're a French player, if you've seen any French games, the next move should be obvious too. It's c5. And we start harassing this d4 pawn with everything that we've got. Okay, the check doesn't make much sense to me. We go knight c6. And at the right moment, we're going to jump into f5 and put even more pressure on the d4 pawn. Yeah, this is Caro-Kann, but like a much better Caro-Kann. It's not a transposition to a Caro-Kann. Okay, I think it's a great time to jump into f5 because it's the tempo move. Now, we can already play CD. We can absolutely already play CD. Anybody watching who's a French player, I know you probably want to go queen b6 here as well. Queen a5 check is a decent move, but it doesn't win a piece because of knight c3. And in that position, if you play c takes d4, white can actually play bishop takes d4, interestingly enough. Although even that option looks very enticing to me. Mike and Tyson. But let's play CD. Let's play simple chess. Let's play CD. Yeah, knight h6 is a really cool move, by the way. I think you'll like it. And I'm setting up a little bit of a trap. I can almost guarantee you that white is calculating bishop takes d4. No, castles. Okay, fine, sure. Now we've got a very vast choice. Like, we have a lot of moves, I think, that basically win the game. Bishop c5 is good. Queen b6 looks like a fantastic move. I like queen b6. Hit the bishop, protect the pawn, take, of course, with the b pawn, so that we can play c5 in the future. Yeah, white is just collapsing here. Why not? Let's just munch. Everything falls here. Okay, knight b to d2. Should we keep munching? I think we shall. DC. Nothing to fear here. There's like a million ways to evacuate, but there is one trap that white could set. White could play the move rook b1 and set an absolutely devilish trap. Instead, he goes queen a4, which is a really easy move to parry. What is the nicest way that we can parry the attack on c6? Don't just automatically play a move like rook c8, especially because it loses the queen. Yeah, queen b5, of course, because the knight is hanging and the queen trade is essentially forced and the game ends immediately. Boom. It's interesting that the bird is so rare. Actually, I think if you know how to play it, the bird system is, the bird opening is not so bad. Bishop takes f3, of course, is a good move to include. And I really like bishop a3 here. Classic idea, cover the promotion square. And that's going to make it much easier to promote the pawn efficiently. We're also up 3 pawns, so none of this is truly necessary. I would say the bird is a slightly underrated opening. It has a very shoddy reputation, but it has quite a bit of venom if you know how to play it. So just as a life pro tip for anybody looking for like an offbeat weapon, you can check out, I think there's some chessable courses on it, but people don't take this opening seriously, even at like the grandmaster level. And I have to say, like, it has some teeth, but you have to like be very disciplined about studying the theory for it. Like, if you play it and you don't know the theory, you're just going to get destroyed with white every time. Okay, so we can win a billion different ways here. Let's just go rook c8. Don't rush with c2. If you had rushed with c2, then white would have gone rook d2, and the pawn potentially would have been lost. Now we just play bishop takes d4. And, okay, the best way to go here is just to use all of your pawns. Let's connect our rooks with king e7. Everything I'm doing here should make perfect sense to you. Rook c4. Trade of rooks is plays to the favor of the side with 3 extra pawns. So let's go ahead and trade off the rooks. Rook c8. White should resign here. Of course, the only thing that you should keep in mind is that you are more than happy to give up 1, even 2 of your pawns in order to transition into a pawn endgame. But here, there is no reason to give up the b-pawn. Who can tell me, based on a simple knowledge of pawn endgames and, you know, typical like setups in pawn endgames, what should black do? Yeah, this is like the gap-tooth pawn formation, which I talk about in my one of my videos on pawn endgames on YouTube. This is a very effective formation because the king is totally stuck. Like, this should be totally ingrained in your memory. Now we can just freeze all of the pawns. Even though h5 isn't necessary, it's good practice to do that just to make sure nothing crazy happens. And we walk your king. Okay, b3, b2. And that's it. Bang. Easy clap. Okay, so very quickly, maybe we'll even get one more 5-minute game in. I'm feeling frisky. Let's paste this one in. So I'll have a link to this blitz game in the description that I played in a Charlotte tournament a couple months ago. It was a very, very interesting game. I'm not claiming that knight h6 is the best move against f4, but it's definitely like a weapon that you could use to take a potentially booked up opponent off guard. And I got to give credit to Robbie Adamson, my close friend, for introducing me to this move. It is very, very uncommon. So just a second. I'm seeing the game Nepomniachtchi Trophy from 2024, Title Tuesday. So e4 is white's most popular, along with knight f3 is white's popular responses. If white plays knight f3, then of course we play d5. And here typically white plays either g3 or e3, essentially a reverse Dutch. After g3, I think the best move is bishop to g4. And a lot of you might be like, but aren't you walking into knight e5? Well, you just drop the bishop back to f5. and then you chase the knight away with f6. Right, so this is not a problem. And here, actually, I like this concept of playing this Jababa London style and castling queenside. Okay, so bishop g4 here is a really nice move. If white plays bishop to g2, then you can go just e6. So you're not fearing the move knight e5. There's a game, Sevian Hambleton, Title Tuesday 2022, reached this position. And Amon failed to play the best move, which is knight to f5. And the reason he failed to play it, I would imagine, is because of knight e5. But black is already winning here. Black is already completely winning. Can anybody tell me why? How is that even possible? Yeah, black is winning. It's not h5, not immediately. Like, what should you start with? Well, you should start with a check. And this is the power of this bishop. Why I can't play e3. Now you play h5. And essentially, like, this mating pattern with the g1 square covered is absolutely unstoppable. Like, there's just nothing that can be done against the threat of h4. Literally nothing that white can do. Nothing at all. So, for example, let's say white plays d3. You just play h4. You sack the bishop, and you win the game with a beautiful little knight sack. But very important in this position, do you take on h3? Nope. You play queen h4. And it's forced mate. Look at this mate. g2 literally just mate. If white plays knight takes g4 directly, then you still take on g3. Then you still take on g3. And then you play h takes g4. White has to block with the bishop. And you can just bring out the queen, let's say to f6, with the intention of then playing rook takes h3 and queen h6. You are completely winning. Pretty incredible stuff, if I may say so myself. Yeah, king g2, rook h3. Just absolutely insane how quickly white's position falls apart. So that's knight f3. Our opponent went e4. And now, of course, the point is to go d5. E takes d5 is like a terrible Scandi for white with the inclusion of this move f4. Almost everybody plays e5 here. I see an MVL game, actually, after bishop g4. But white is already worse. White is already worse. So if white plays bishop e2, which is what Maxime Vachier-Lagrave played in a Title Tuesday game, yeah, you can just take and play e6. Again, phenomenal French, or like a good Caro-Kann, however you want to refer to it. And the moment white plays d4, you can follow up with c5. It's just incredibly strong. Knight f3, e6. d4 just throws more oil onto the fire. And after c5, I would say white is borderline lost. There's two games in the database. Both of them continued c3, knight c6. And, okay, a 1900 here played bishop e2 and got absolutely run into the ground. Bishop f3, cd, cd, knight f5. White cannot defend the d-pawn. White cannot defend the d-pawn. So, like, it's just terrible. Bishop b5, knight c6, and everything I did here, I would say, is very natural. Like, c takes d4. The one comment I want to make is, if white would have played bishop takes d4, who can tell me how black should, like, how does black gain material here? On the topic of whole board awareness, super important, whole board awareness, not fixating on, like, the fun side of the board. Yeah, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and seeing that you can actually go to h4 with your queen and winning the f4 pawn. And just everything collapses. So instead, white castled, we played queen b6. Last thing I would say, in this position, white could have played this very devilish move, rook b1. Some of you might be tempted by queen takes d2, but this is a trap. Because here suddenly white jumps to a4, and black loses because, well, queen takes c6 and knight takes d2 are threatened. So after rook b1, we would have just evacuated our queen to a3. It's always important to stay vigilant with regards to, like, your opponent's ideas, especially when there's a weakness. Queen a4, queen b5 ends the game. So this was the trap. Yeah, like, I would play rook b1 with white. That's essentially all I have. I think there were some questions. There were some people asking about queen b5, but I'm not sure where. So maybe it was here, bishop g4. Where was queen b5 a move? Oh, bishop e2. Sorry, yeah, bishop e2. I see. So here, queen b5 check. No, but come on, like, white is not developed at all. Like, you should never be afraid of a move like queen b5 check. All right, just like knight c6 is even good. Queen takes b7. And Okay, look at the knight d4, knight g4. Like, this is not something you even have to calculate. Because even if you are afraid to go for this and you just go for development, you know that you'll have full compensation. Okay, so you can do some analysis on your own. But now I have 4 knight h6. Thank me later. This is a really underrated move. And that's where we'll end the speedrun, guys. It's been a long stream. I think it's a good time to call it a night. I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Those of you who watched on YouTube, hope you enjoyed. See you guys later. Thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out.